you make a very good case that provisionism is a lot more consistent with a rejection of Calvinism than classical Arminianism or Lutheranism. I don't think Romans 9 is, of course, the only text that indicates this. And there, of course, if there were no faithful non-Calvinistic interpretations of Romans 9, everyone would agree with Calvinistic predestination. I think in conjunction with other passages like the parable of the sower, where the same seed is scattered on different grounds, and depending on what kind of soil someone is, that determines how well they're going to receive the gospel. I think that has very Calvinistic implications. There's a lot of things. I think there's, of course, it says God hardened Pharaoh's heart, but then there's another passage that says Pharaoh hardened his own heart. So there's a lot of things we could go over, and I know that people probably...
I can respond to those two real quick. Sure. Yeah. I think we have some responsibility to the condition of the soil of our hearts. I think if the Bible warns you, when you hear his voice, do not harden your heart. And so the soil can become hard by ignoring the things of God. So they became calloused or hardened by ignoring the things of God, just like one can cultivate their heart by going to church or listening to truth or, seeking after the things of God. And so I think the condition of your heart, you do have some responsibility of that. We're not just inanimate objects who are just destined or born with a certain heart condition that we can't control, in my estimation. And with regard to hardening, it literally means, in the original text, it literally means to strengthen one in the resolve. And so if one is resolved to do something evil, God may strengthen them in that resolve temporarily to bring about a particular good through that evil action. And that's what we would say, for example, that Pharaoh would be doing, or God would be doing through the hardening of Pharaoh, is that he's strengthening him in his resolve to keep the Israelites as a slave labor in order to demonstrate his power through those plagues. And same thing he's doing to Israel during the time of Jesus. He's hardening them in their already rebellious, self-righteous condition so as to bring about the crucifixion and the engrafting of the Gentiles.
Why don't you come back on that, Zoomer, and then we'll just move on from there. How's that?
Yeah, sure. I would say that there is a hardening of people's own hearts to the gospel. There also is a judicial hardening. God does increase people's evil, so we wouldn't deny that exists. It just seems that in all of these passages, especially when Jesus talks about like who is able to hear his word, he says, "My sheep hear my voice." So that presupposes that the people who hear his voice are already a sheep before they hear his voice. And there's I know you don't like that.
I want to talk real bad. He's not going to let me go again, but I want to talk real bad about that. Go ahead.
Well, respond to that. So sorry. I'm sorry for bringing something else up.
No. It's not. It's fine. Everybody who watches my show knows what I say about sheep.
It's really the same idea as the parable of the sower. The seed being scattered on different types of soil presupposes that there is already something different about those types of soil. So I don't think it's a reliable interpretation to say that people are actively hardening their hearts in response to the gospel, because if the soil is already rocky before seed is scattered on it, that means people are already hardened before they ever even heard the gospel. So that implies that the condition of one's the condition of whether someone will accept the gospel or not is prior to the actual hearing of the gospel, which I think implies Calvinistic predestination.
Leighton, just go ahead and say what's on your heart.
I can't.
It'll be therapeutic.
You know me. You know me. When it comes to, I just don't want to. I don't want to deny him the last word. So, Richard, you can still have the last word, but I've got to respond to the sheep thing. But the sheep is the same condition as the soil thing. Okay, especially in this context, because there are some people who've been listening to God, like Cornelius, Lydia, worshiper of God. They listened to God, so they would have been considered people with the softer soil, or a soil that was prepared for the gospel of Jesus in particular. And so the same with sheep. Followers of God were considered sheep, followers of God. So you don't believe in me, the Son, because you're not a follower of my Father who sent me. He's not saying you don't believe in me because I never wanted you to, or I don't really like you, I didn't choose you. He wept over these people. He longed to gather them, holding out his hands, and all these other things that the Bible initiates. And so the sheep, the same as the soils, is that, remember, Jesus didn't enter into just a vacuum. He entered into a world of people, some of which who were God-fearing people who really followed the Lord, whose soil was prepared for the seed of the gospel of Jesus, and others who were not. There were some who were sheep, followers of God, and therefore they would follow the Son because they have the same voice, and sheep recognize the voice of the shepherd. And if Jesus has the same voice as the Father, then they're going to recognize that voice and follow him. And the same with the soil. If they're following God, listening to him with wisdom and those kinds of things, as they're supposed to be, like Cornelius would have done, then the seed is ripe for Peter to show up from Joppa and to drop that seed right there for him to hear it. And so that's the way I would answer those questions. I don't see those as predestinarian at all in the Calvinistic sense, but instead more in the context of what's happening historically with Jesus being introduced for the first time into that culture.
Right. That is an interpretation you could take. I think your tendency to interpret this really comes down to how strong of a doctrine of original sin and total depravity you have. Because I know you critiqued Augustinian presuppositions. I am definitely very much an Augustinian. I start with the presupposition that everyone deserves eternal damnation from the moment of conception, and everyone is totally depraved from the moment of conception. So that means two things. Number one, it means no one deserves to be elect. God could damn everyone and would be just. And I also believe that because of total depravity, because our will was fundamentally altered by the sin of Adam, we cannot come to God unless something actually happens to free our will from that bondage to sin. That's why classical Arminianism teaches prevenient grace, which is that first God addresses the slavery to sin that our wills have. Again, God sort of restores everyone, restores all men to a state where they can accept the gospel. So my last question for you, not really a debate, just a clarification on what provisionism is. Would you agree with prevenient grace? Would you agree with that, with the classical Arminian position that we are, because of the fall, unable to accept the gospel and God has to free us from that, and he does that for all men?
No, that's one of the distinctions that we have. But I will point out that there are modern, even Wesleyan Arminians that differ from classical Arminians. I mean, even Brian Abishano has a difference with Roger Olson among Arminianism. And so provisionism, we would disagree with the concept and idea that we lost the ability to respond positively to the gospel, that the gospel is a form of prevenient grace. The incarnation is a prevenient grace in the sense that we need those things in order to believe. We need revelation, we need light, we need truth. But we're not born with a hardened heart already. It can grow calloused and hardened, which is one of the reasons we think Jesus uses a child. You must humble yourself like this child. Being humble means to be moldable. And a child is, as all of us know from experience, more moldable and teachable than an adult who's already set in their ways. And so one can grow hardened and calloused and blinded to the truth when they hear the truth and they trade it in for lies. They grow defiled, and they're not born that way already. And I think the Augustinian grid assumes they're already born, in essence, hardened and blinded, and therefore can't even see the truth of the gospel unless God does some kind of unilateral work on their nature to cause them to have an ability that he caused them to lose, and like to fix what he decreed them to be born as, or something like that. I just don't see that anywhere. I think that's, again, Augustinian baggage. Prior to Augustine, even according to Calvinistic historians, that's not what was taught about the anthropology of man. And
Okay.
so I would call myself pre-Augustinian with regard to anthropology. I don't believe people are born with that inability.
Okay, so if you reject Augustinian anthropology, would you also reject the Council of Orange, which condemns semi-Pelagianism?
I just don't care about the Council of Orange.
Okay, that's a fair position to take, especially if you it makes sense because Augustine also believed in infant baptism, and he made that very popular in the church. So that makes sense from
Orange, as long as along with many other councils, actually condemned a lot of what Calvinists today teach. And so I see, I'm not saying there's no value in the councils. Well, I think we can learn a lot from the councils and the development of certain doctrines. I don't think we should be just ignorant of them and just say, hey, who cares about all those things? And that's not what I mean by I don't care. What I mean by I don't care is that's not my authority. And so they made a lot of errors in those councils that you're mentioning, and so I don't have a problem contradicting something that they concluded, because that's really not my authority.
Okay, so what do you think about the idea that if you start with an Augustinian anthropology, if you start with a strong doctrine of original sin and total depravity, would you say that Calvinistic predestination makes more sense with that?
It does fit that better, yes. The total inability is the root or the foundation of the entire systematic. That's one of the reasons I think classical Arminians have not done a very good job in comparison to Calvinists as far as the debate structure, because they give up the argument. They start on the Augustinian grid, and they don't know what to do with hardening, as far as I can tell. That's an overstatement. Obviously, they have answers. I just don't think their answers are very strong, and they give up too much, I think, with regard to the anthropology and concept of the way in which God made us. And I'll just say this real quick, Richard. There's not a huge distinction, because both of us believe it's God-given ability. Whether it's given to us by birth, naturally through our conscience that he created within us, or he gifts it to us, graces it to us at some later point in life through some nebulous way that we can't describe, it's still from God. We're not trying to argue, provisionists, we go out to the tool shed and we build ourselves a free will, or something like that. We both believe it's from God. And we both believe it's resistible in the sense that we can either go one way or the other once God, grants us that ability. But I'm just being real clear about that, because there's a lot of times people make just so much hay of it, like as if we're trying to claim something more than what the Arminian is claiming as far as what God gets credit for, and we're simply not.
Right. Okay. So I guess I will close by saying, when it comes to individual passages, as for most important doctrines, I don't think there's individual proof texts for or against Calvinistic predestination. I think that the proof text passages like the sheep and the goats, or the parable of the sower, or Romans 9, you could interpret that in multiple ways. I think Scripture interprets Scripture. So I think I would first argue for an Augustinian anthropology by looking at the passages that talk about human sin and stuff, and then I'd move on to that. We don't need to debate that now. I know the audience has questions they want to get to. So I think, to conclude, I would say the productive thing that we discussed here is that you make a very good case that provisionism is a lot more consistent with a rejection of Calvinism than classical Arminianism or Lutheranism.
Sounds pretty good to me. It's progress.